IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Today we have with us a special guest. We have Professor Walter Ladwig from King's College London, and I also have with me Manoj, and we're here to talk about a bunch of things. Professor Ladwig is, I think, perhaps best known in India for this paper from about a decade back.
At least a decade, yeah.
Cold Start to Hot Wars, which basically everybody in India has read. But he's also written a book, The Forgotten Front, subtitled Patron-Client Relationships and Counterinsurgency. And we're going to start by talking about Dr. Ladwig's book and then move on to that paper from a decade back. One thing that strikes me about this book is it's wonderfully unfashionably timed. You know, this is a time when a lot of people in this field are talking about great power competition and so on. And you go back to counterinsurgency, and it seems to make sense to me because A, it's an ongoing subject, and B, it's also a field in which future great power competition might actually play out. First, I just want to start with what got you interested in this subject. What is it about, and how did you go about this?
Well, great to be here with you guys. So the first thing I would say about the counterinsurgency, you're right to say that it's not so fashionable at the moment, but I think if you look there, you see these, at least from a U.S. perspective, these historical regularities. So from the time the U.S. was exiting Vietnam and declared never again to their intervention in El Salvador was about 12 years. And from the end of the Salvadoran Civil War to September 11th was about 12 years. So I think about 12 years after the U.S. finally exits Afghanistan, we might want to be dusting some of these books off the shelf. But in terms of how it came about, I mean, when I started my PhD, the U.S., the U.K., many NATO countries were in Iraq, were in Afghanistan, and building partner militaries was one of the key components of their strategy, their exit strategy. So, there was an interest in this kind of technical aspect, right? How you organize the forces and what do you do with them? But as I looked at the problem and considered this as a course of study, it seemed time and time again, whether you were talking about what at the time was contemporary Iraq and Afghanistan or historical episodes, that it was politics that really kept being the major issue. It wasn't that you didn't have the right, blueprint for what a military should look like. It was that the local government didn't want to do the things that you thought they should because they either had a different agenda or their, your suggestions you were making might make sense from a rational technocratic standpoint, how to improve military efficiency. Well, if you're a country in which you look, or you're a government in which you look at your military as a potential source of instability or challenge to your power, making them really strong and independent and capable doesn't actually sound like a very good idea.
Yeah. So coup-proofing is...
coup-proofing, dividing rival elites, not allowing independent bases of power to come up, not devolving authority or power to groups that you think are suspect. The U.S. has the counterinsurgency approach. It's all about sort of reform and inclusivity and building open societies, and they expect their partners will follow suit, right? We're working together. We want the same thing. And you get a fellow like Maliki in Iraq who wants to pursue a very narrow sectarian agenda. And the Bush administration, if they recognized it, they certainly did nothing to arrest it. And sort of all of the work you're trying to do ultimately gets undone or destroyed. I mean, you could draw a line from sort of Maliki's policies and the Bush administration's failures to restrain him to the rise of the Islamic State.
Yeah. So I'm just going to sort of roll it back a little bit. So what you've said essentially establishes one thing, that there exists, at least in popular discourse, this false dichotomy between fighting terrorism and counterinsurgency and nation building. They will inherently go hand in hand, whatever the politicians might say. That's what you're basically trying to tell us, right?
Well, I'm saying that if you try to think that, so right now, the U.S. is in a never again kind of moment. And so everyone's excited about security assistance, right? We're not going to send our troops overseas. We're going to partner and build local militaries and train them. And the mistake is thinking that that's an apolitical activity, right? That simply increasing the technical capabilities of an armed force does not affect the broader society. And also not recognizing that training individuals or training small numbers of troops and then feeding them back into a bad system or a bad organization is not going to lead to any better outcomes. So both to have a positive effect, to make your aid worth something, you have to be willing to make changes or somehow either kind of compel or induce changes to an organization and a structure. Otherwise, you're just going to perpetuate the bad outcome. So it may not always require full-fledged nation building, but the idea, if you kind of think back to when Trump was first elected and he announced this increase in number of military trainers in Afghanistan, and he said, we're going to build up the Afghan military, we're going to make them strong, but I'm not going to tell them how to govern, I'm not going to tell them what their policy should be. Right then I knew this is not going to accomplish very much. Because if you don't try to at least pair your aid with some kind of assistance to reshaping or restructuring the problematic institutions that have led you to this situation, how's it going to get better?
Then therein sort of lies this fundamental friction, right, between what you describe as a patron and a client state. There's going to be deep friction within them always. This is never going to be a relationship which is going to be harmonious, to say, and you're always going to find that if you place some of these conditions for reform on the client state, you're going to find pushback, you're going to find potentially suboptimal outcomes, and in that case, you then need to prioritize in whether you want to have that reform as a priority or whether you actually want to see just your immediate security goals being met, right?
Yeah, so the first thing to say is, and this is really where I think the U.S. historically and again today falls down, is not recognizing that their local partner is an independent actor with their own agenda and their own priorities that are not the same, right? Everyone may agree, yes, we want to defeat the Islamic State, but how we want to do it and what trade-offs we're willing to make, as you point out, absolutely the case. And then, yes, security assistance is not a perfect goal or not a perfect tool. There is only so much you can achieve. You're not going to get sort of 100% outcomes. So you have to decide, okay, if we're not going to do this ourselves, if we're going to work through somebody else, with somebody else, you have to accept that the outcomes will be necessarily diminished. There's a ceiling on what you can achieve.
Okay, so let's just look at an example. In your book, you talk about many different examples, but I'm going to take a completely different example and I'm going to try and let you analyze that for us. The US and Pakistan and that relationship. It's gone through its ups and downs. It's from the era of, and I'm not even going back way back.
Yes.
I'm going back to just post-September 11th, when Bush sort of threatens about bombing them into the Stone Age, and then the cooperation with Musharraf, and subsequently the ups and downs thereafter. To today, when we have Donald Trump, he's withdrawn security assistance, he's stopped the money that's been going to the Pakistanis. How effective has the US been in achieving its sort of broader security objectives in terms of its patent sort of client relationship with Pakistan?
So I think the U.S. had made a mistake for a number of years and kind of fell into the same sort of trap I describe in the book by assuming that once that they had gotten Musharraf and once they had gotten the Pakistan government supposedly on side, that they just opened the floodgates, right? And some $33 billion, primarily in military assistance, would lead to a high degree of cooperation. And what we saw instead, of course, is exactly what we'd predict from an independent actor pursuing its own agenda. Selective cooperation, right? Targeting groups that affect the Pakistani state, not so much of a concern about things that necessarily undermine Afghanistan. Cooperation on drone targeting when it suits, not so much when it doesn't. So in terms of compliance, and again, recognizing you're never going to get 100% compliance, once I would even give some credit to sort of the latter Obama years and under Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, where they started sort of turning off some of the coalition reimbursement funds or making it kind of clear. All of a sudden, you saw this frenetic activity on the part of the Pakistani military. All of a sudden, these long-standing American demands for military operations in the tribal areas started happening. Now, yes, they had their own reasons for doing this, but certainly I think the desire to keep the taps flowing contributed positively to that. Again, just telling someone you're going to back them 100%, that you're going to kind of pay for everything. What sort of incentive do they have to really listen to you? So I think the pressure tactics did succeed to an extent, but of course, as I said before, there's an upper bounds to what you can achieve via this tool.
Yeah, this idea of patrons and clients actually has some resonance for us in India, because in our quasi-federal structure, You have central and state governments,
Yeah.
and they frequently don't have the same agenda when fighting an insurgency. The sense that we get in India is that once an insurgency breaks out and there's this gravy train from the central government, nobody really wants it to stop. And I think there's something similar at work here. Right?
Absolutely.
And you actually look at three very interesting case studies. You look at the Philippines, 47 to 53, support for the M's government in South Vietnam and El Salvador. What are some of the common themes that emerge from these case studies, and why did you select these?
So I looked at these because these were the three most significant U.S. efforts to support counterinsurgency efforts during the Cold War. And so I'm interested in this. Again, this is the phenomenon of security assistance, assisting a government, but not necessarily sending your own troops. And so what they illustrate is three very different outcomes with respect to both the U.S. strategy and sort of level of cooperation. So if we think, and in the book, I kind of look at a dichotomy of two influence approaches. Inducement, at the one hand, we've been talking about, you sort of open the taps, you provide sort of unconditional political support. And then conditionality, which is still supportive, but as with, the IMF World Bank conditionality, it kind of identifies, we expect this, you will do that, then the aid comes. And support's a little more selective, right? You don't tell a government unconditionally you back them. So the most unambiguously successful case is the Philippines, and it's one in which the Truman administration went down the conditionality route, and they were really tough. They really held the Philippine government's feet to the fire. They really forced both political and defense reforms that had very positive effects of improving the effectiveness and efficiency of the Philippine military in counterinsurgency, but also rammed through some social reforms in terms of a small degree, admittedly, of land reform, minimum wage for agricultural laborers, and things that really struck at the heart of the Huck insurgency. And, in some respects, and this sounds kind of very heretical when you're talking about assisting a government, they arguably even undermined the ruling Carino government of the day by setting the stage for a reform-minded defense minister in Ramon Magsaysay to eventually win an election and become a person who could provide the kind of reforms that led to victory. So, again, you might assist a government, assist a country, but that doesn't mean you're tied to the government of the day. Vietnam then is the exact opposite, right? The Kennedy and Eisenhower administrations in the period I look at had pretty much the same goals, right? They wanted to restructure the armed forces. They wanted to bring about a degree of social reforms that would help stave off some of the pressure. But they only went down the inducement route. Like they tied themselves tightly to Diem's government. They gave unconditional support. And they really found that this led to nothing positive, right? And eventually he's overthrown. And then El Salvador, I guess, is the case that kind of demonstrates the variability, because you saw mixed outcomes. You saw very successful development and, in some respects, reorientation of the armed forces. You saw some degree of social reform in terms of land reform, but then other areas, sadly, human rights abuses, really not anywhere near as much as you'd like to see. And the Carter and the Reagan and the Bush 41 administrations had very schizophrenic approaches to influence. So at times inducement, at other times conditionality. But when you go across both the Salvadoran case, and if you step back and look at all three, there's about 26 different episodes of influence identified. The most successful areas of cooperation are all associated with conditionality, and inducement, basically nothing gets delivered. So I think it provides a good amount of evidence, or the kind of evidence we can have with at least these historical deep dives, right? This isn't a large end study, but I think it does give us some very suggestive conclusions that this kind of cooperation is much more closely tied with conditionality than inducement.
What is it that then pushes governments to go in for inducements without conditionalities?
That is a fantastic question, and this is one that is really frustrating. The first thing, of course, is we don't learn from our history, right? No one goes back and studies the Philippines and finds it so successful. I really think when it comes down to it, it seems very confusing and even inappropriate to a policymaker, right? If you are someone at the State Department or the Defense Department and you're charged with assisting the government of country Y, well, we're assisting them. We want them to succeed. So pressuring them, forcing reform upon them, and threatening to withhold aid does not seem like the way you go about assisting a country, right? These are our guys.
Yeah.
It's the bad guys they're fighting against. And then there's also, there's programmatic issues that I found in my course of my research, again, which makes sense. You are the local aid administrator. You've got a 5-year development project you're running in this country. Having someone, a big boss in Washington, turn on and off the taps messes up your programs you don't want to deliver. That you do want to deliver. You don't want to have those disruptions, and also we get a degree of maybe you'll call it clientitis, right? People working in a country, they want their country to succeed. They tend to want to see the best in reform's really around the corner, and so this idea just seems to cut across whether it's a bureaucratic incentive or just the logic of how you assist a country. But this time and time again, in many respects, implementing this kind of strategy, half the battle is convincing the patron government that the influence actually flows more from pressure than it does from unstinting cooperation.
I just wonder about inducements, and at least in the case of South Vietnam. Was it also because this was the height of the Cold War and the Americans really desperately wanted these guys to succeed and were willing to look the other way?
I mean, to an extent, but, the Philippine government was equally, I would say even more so important to the U.S. in this period of time. If you think about it, this was sort of the showpiece. The backdrop was not only communism, though I think we could debate about the degree to which the Hucks were really hardcore communists, but, the Truman administration was trying to convince the Dutch and the British and the French to decolonize in Southeast Asia. And so showing that the Philippines could be independent, could be successful, the United States, gave them their independence, let them go, was really important. So from U.S. foreign policy goals in the region, I would say they were equally comparable, but they were much more willing to push hard to the Philippine government of the day than in Vietnam. It was certainly the case that the U.S. didn't want to lose Vietnam, but I would argue, again, I know there's this whole, thousands and thousands of books on, could Vietnam have been won? And I'm not suggesting I'm going on that route, but I do think this is a period of time in which different choices could have been made with important outcomes, and we don't study it enough.
All right, okay, let's now look at something very different. We'll take a look at the framework that you've already spoken to us about, and we'll try and apply that to Afghanistan today, or maybe Afghanistan a couple of years from now. So let's imagine a world in which the Americans have come to some sort of an agreement with the Taliban and the Afghan government, and you've got some sort of an Afghan leadership which involves these different parties. Sort of this intra-Afghan dialogue has taken place, and you have an Afghanistan government now which involves different stakeholders. And the US presence has whittled down to, say, a minimal security presence. In such a scenario, there are probably going to be some other stakeholders that are going to be guarantors of some sort. The Chinese, the Russians are going to play some sort of a role. Pakistan will obviously play an important role in that dynamic. In such a scenario, obviously, US security interests will still remain because it's not like Afghan society or the Taliban is immediately going to change. How do you then maintain a relationship with a client state which probably has more than one patron, and how do you then ensure security? What sort of would inducements work? Would conditions work because you have more patrons? How do you then balance that?
It's a fantastic question, and it's going to be a very, very tough puzzle, because more patrons or more potential patrons mean that the local government has greater freedom of action. It has the ability to play off different elements amongst each other. And so I think one thing that will have to happen on the part of the U.S. is certainly identifying the other patron partners who have sort of like-minded goals and similar goals. And, it may be the case that you have to draw that bar pretty low about where you can get cooperation and consensus. But the ability to play one power off of another will make it quite hard to sort of really go forward with with a conditionality type approach. It's still possible, but again, although I was not looking at episodes with multiple patrons, this phenomenon did come up in the course of some of my episodes where the U.S. government itself was divided. So the State Department wanted one approach, the Department of Defense wanted another, USAID wanted another. And you even saw in Vietnam, for example, ZM could play the DoD off of state, off of aid, and deflect pressure in that way. So the phenomenon, it'll just be that much more difficult. But it also means coordinating amongst these actors to the extent which you can find this really need to happen to move the situation forward in a positive manner.
So that would probably create some sort of room for India to also be part of that grouping, because there would be, at least at a certain level, there would be some common interests that India and the US share, particularly on counterterrorism, radicalization, and those sorts of goals.
Absolutely, and then it will be that much more important that it becomes that much more important that everyone who's a significant sort of aid giver or supporter of the government is all in the room and is at the table, because the very fact that that assistance is being rendered, and if it's even done just sort of agnostically to other efforts, will undermine influence attempts because of the fact that, again, this is an independent source. And you're like, well, you can tell me what you want to do all day long, but I've got this tranche from Delhi that's going to be flowing in regardless of what you tell me. So getting all of those people around the table and designing or identifying a common program will be very significantly important.
And I think that also tells me that the Chinese are going to have a significant amount of influence just because of the capital that they might be able to throw in.
No question at all. And I mean, the good news is it's possible to understand a lot of Chinese interests. They want stability. They want a central government that can deliver on ensuring that their various, Belt and Road, Silk Road initiatives in surrounding areas don't get, destabilized. Of course, at the end of the day, they're going to care more about Uyghur separatists than they are about human rights abuses on the behalf of the Taliban, and that's just a price that we'll have to accept. But what they fundamentally want there is potentially not so different, or it's something that can be worked with.
Should we now go and look at cold start?
Oh my gosh!
So I was reading through the paper again, and I realized that you spoke about integrated battle groups essentially operationalizing this. And today we have integrated battle groups.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
So how do you now look at the scenario? Because I think you wrote this paper in 2007. If I'm correct.
Yes, quite a long time ago.
So it's been 12 years. All right. So how do you see? Firstly, how has your argument aged?
I think it's aged reasonably well, in the sense that what I, at the end of the day, was suggesting was that this was a military approach that made sense from a kind of narrow military technical approach. A problem. And again, I'm very sympathetic to the situation that the Army finds itself in. It's responsible for, whether it's been told to or whether it's just been left holding the bag, it's responsible for dealing with the situation. It only has military means available to solve what, at the end of the day, is a military political problem. Yeah. So there's only so much that can be accomplished. But it's that question of how you translate whatever military gains can be had from operations into useful political outcomes at an acceptable level of risk in a nuclear environment. I think that problem is still fundamentally with us. Yeah. I think, when you look at studies and talks about integrated battle groups and what has been achieved and what's going on, it focuses on still very material things. So mobilization times have increased. Armor has been placed more forward towards the border. The former holding corps are now capable of carrying out sort of their own independent type operations. They're not just there to wait around for, the big strike corps to eventually come up from the rear. So all of those things are useful in a variety of situations. But whether this question can be answered about how and where we grab land or inflict significant harm such that something useful can come from this. And by something useful, I would presume it would be to do with groups like Jaish or Lashkar being really put on the leash, if not dismantled. I still have a hard time seeing how that process really unfolds. I mean, are you going to go there and you're going to go sit on a patch of land for 5 years because, you're not just going to trust these guys to do another catch and release program. You're going to need some kind of verification. You're going to need some kind of really irreversible actions. And so how likely is that to happen, and how much has to be done to really get your threshold of confidence? It just, I think it's still hard to see how this gets us to a positive outcome.
So the end game with cold start has always, I think, been unclear to all of us. But there's also the more immediate problem of not having both political buy-in and buy-in from the other services, right?
Yes.
Has that changed since you wrote your paper?
So I've seen no evidence of it. I mean, I think the Army chief, first off, addressing cold start as he did at the beginning last January, for the first time sort of in ages, right? The thing had gone very dormant for a while. We had new euphemisms, proactive strategies. No one was actually using the cold start phrase. That seemed to be a little toxic, particularly given how the Pakistanis have sort of run, or the Pakistani military has run with that as the new boogeyman, the cause of all of South Asia's ills. So that was really fascinating, and the fact that he seems to be really pushing forward on these overt reorganization. I've been told, I understand that there's been a lot that's actually been done internal to the Army in terms of restructuring of reporting lines and things that are really hard for observers like us on the outside to recognize. But I'm not aware that the PMO has sort of checked a box or signed a memo that says this is the way to go. And again, I've been led to understand that the Army has had conversations with the Air Force about what combat operations would look like and tasking orders and such. But this is the kind of thing, combined arms warfare, inter-service warfare takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of work, and it's not just something you throw together in an instant. So I have not yet seen that sort of level of routine cooperation that I would look for to say, like, okay, these guys are really going seamlessly, because this is the kind of thing you want to have it 100% ready to go before you encounter all the fog and friction and chaos of war.
Yeah.
Most of us over here in the Takshashila institution are fairly skeptical of cold start.
Yeah.
You won't find a lot of buy-in here either. But what are India's other options, do you think, conventional options to respond to Pakistan?
So I think the one option was on display, I guess, after Pulwama, which I think is long-range airstrikes or some kind of cross-border strikes or firing. I'd be really reticent to counsel the use of missiles for the sort of dual-use confusion, but I think strikes from one side could be effective. Certainly at signaling, potentially at a little bit of degrading capabilities. But it starts to become really difficult because you have to kind of posit what level of punishment would be necessary to bring about a reversal of this long-held government policy. And again, I think it would have to be pretty high. So then that leads me to one other sort of realm of possibility, which is something more in the special forces area, right? So looking along the lines of the kind of capacity that Navy SEALs or the British SAS have, where you could, in theory, actually have people who could go, for lack of a better term, take the fight to some of these groups more directly. And again, my understanding is that to date there is some capacity within the Indian military, but a lot of the special forces tend to be a bit more like elite light infantry commando guys. So they can do a crack cross-border raid, but they're not necessarily going to be, blending into a village for 6 months, surveilling a target that then can have a bomb dropped on his head. But that might have to be the kind of capability that could accomplish this at a reasonable level of risk, but also both inflict harm, but I think also create the uncertainty, because one of the things that academic research shows on going after terrorist and insurgent groups is that, whether it's decapitation at the very top levels or disruption, being able to show that you can target these guys, get them on the move, get them mistrusting their own fellows and couriers and communications links, you can actually do an important amount of disruption, even if you can't get your hands on that number one guy you'd like to nab.
Yeah, in fact, the Indian Army actually, I think, understands this and actually executes this domestically, when dealing with insurgents. But like you said, India is going to have to develop new capabilities to do that across the border.
And even to sustain that across the border because this would have to be a sustained operation.
Yes, yeah.
It won't be a strike. It
No.
will be a sustained thing. To be able to do that in hostile territory for a long period of time would require some sort of presence over there. Not just covert presence. You need much more than that. You would need some sort of support. Unless you have allies that are working with you to be able to do that, there's no way that you're going to be able to execute that.
And you need a lot of, and in fairness, things that are being built out, but a lot of real-time surveillance capabilities, probably more, even more in the realm of kind of satellite observation, real-time data links communication. Again, these are things that are being developed, but it's a very tough problem. It's a very tough problem, and I don't for a second want to give the impression when I write about Cold Start that I'm 100% sympathetic to the task that the Indian military and the Indian Army in particular has been left with, because it's not an easy problem to solve by any means. And again, when you only have a military tool to use, there's only so much that can be accomplished. It's ultimately a political military issue.
Okay, this has been a wonderful and very enlightening discussion. Thank you so much, Professor Ladwig. And thank you, Manoj.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This has been very fun.
Fantastic. I've loved my visit to Bangalore, and I'm looking forward to coming back soon.
Wonderful.
Look forward to having you here with us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
How many times have you caught yourself Googling stuff on health and wondering if it's the right information? How many times have you heard different health experts give opposing views, which has only left you confused? There are rising cases of cancer, heart, diabetes, stress, and autoimmune diseases. Meet the patients and the experts who paved the path of true healing. Join me, Rachna Chachi, cancer nutrition coach and nutritional therapist on Heal and Hearty. I take you through my own journey of recovery from an incurable disease and the journey of so many others who healed only via nutrition and holistic healing. Find the answers you seek for what's good for your health and what's good for your soul. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcast.com. Don't forget your date with good health.
Do you wish you were smarter? Well, so do we. But the next best thing?
We could make you sound smarter.
And to help you with this endeavor, we are Simplified, a podcast that attempts to break down the complex world around you with a little knowledge, a lot of poor jokes, and a ton of random trivia.
Episodes out every Monday.
On the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
See ya!